Well, you've heard a lot about the negotiation with the Taliban. It even drew fire or an outbreak of journalism from the likes of Matt Lauer to Jay Carney the other day regarding the negotiation with the Taliban, aka terrorists. Roll it.
Taliban. Is this semantics here, Jay? Are we calling it a prisoner swap when in fact it is negotiating with terrorists?
We've made clear for years, Matt, that we would aggressively engage in an effort to recover Sergeant Bergdahl. That's what we do when our men and women are held as prisoners of war. And you know that direct talks with the Taliban broke down in 2012, and they have not resumed. But we've made every effort we could in order to secure his release, and we're extremely gratified that after 5 years he's now safe and beginning the process of reintegration into the United States.
Yeah, but the terrorists are celebrating this, Jay, and in some ways they now know there is a going rate that one American in captivity can win the release of 5 terrorists being held by the United States. Do you worry that that sets a very dangerous precedent?
Well, I'd caution anyone against buying the propaganda of terrorists, first of all. Secondly, it is absolutely a situation with a long history and precedent where we engage in exchange of prisoners during an armed conflict. Sergeant Bergdahl was in our military, and he was being held by the enemy. And
okay, our guest joining us now, Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on AFR Talk, is the man who literally wrote the book about Guantanamo Bay and so much regarding the Taliban and the detainees there. Thomas Joscelyn, he's a senior editor of the Long War Journal. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is also a writer for the Weekly Standard. What you have known and learned about these 5 detainees that were released for Sergeant Bergdahl, Tom Joscelyn, the source. Tom, welcome back.
Hey, Crane, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. There's a number of questions and a lot to get to, and I know you have been packed with requests because you're explaining who these people are. You just heard the exchange between Matt Lauer and Jay Carney, and then you had this from the mainstream media, 18-second clip of just them highlighting this may be a path forward for negotiations in the future. Roll it.
This is potentially a good sign if you think about the future of Afghanistan. If Bergdahl was held by the Haqqani network, really the most hardened Taliban fighters who operate out of Pakistan, does this pave the way for perhaps a new round of negotiations with the Taliban directly between the United States and the Taliban about the Taliban's future in running Afghanistan?
This exchange represented a rare diplomatic breakthrough between the United States and the Taliban. Fascinating to hear the special forces were on the phone with the Taliban negotiating all these details. What does this mean, do you think, for the future of Afghanistan, for the future of talks with the Taliban?
All right, let's break this down. We're talking about the release of these detainees.
That was David Gregory in the first one. Who was in the second one?
The second one was, I believe, I have to go back. My apologies, Tom. That may have been CBS News. And so...
Well, let me just be frank, okay?
Yeah.
That is delusional. Absolutely delusional. This was not a breakthrough in negotiations. The Taliban, and there's not going to be any further reconciliation talks, the Taliban actually said, after they got their 5 senior Taliban commanders back, which is what they've wanted since 2002, that they were not going, I repeat, not going to engage any further reconciliation talks. That was their official statement right after receiving these 5 senior Taliban leaders. This was not, I really object to this on multiple grounds. I mean, this was not a negotiation, okay? What happened was the Taliban said for years, we want our 5 senior Taliban leaders back. These are the worst of the worst. These are the guys who we can count on the most to carry out our bidding, and we want them back. And eventually, the Obama administration decided to give them back. Now, the Taliban giving up Bo Bergdahl for their 5 senior Taliban leaders is not exactly some sophisticated negotiation or trade. It just isn't. It was just acquiescing to the demands of the Taliban. They couldn't care less about giving up Sergeant Bo Bergdahl for the 5 senior leaders they got back. That's the point. I mean, see, here's what I'm saying. If you walk in and do a negotiation for a used car or go in to do any kind of business transaction at arm's length, there's going to be some haggling on both sides. There was no haggling here. This is just the Taliban saying, here's what we'll give you in exchange for our 5 senior leaders, and the Obama administration decided to make that happen. Now, this is a deal that Senate Democrats objected to in 2012. This is a deal that the Obama administration could not inform Congress of this time around because they knew there would be objections. This is a deal that Qatar, which is a totally duplicitous nation in this fight against terrorism and a major hub for fundraising for jihadis, including Taliban and Al-Qaeda, was very willing to basically secure. That should be a warning flag. The Taliban wanted this. They wanted these guys in Doha, Qatar. I mean, there's no aspect of this other than sort of emotional sentimentality of bringing an American soldier home, which I understand. But even there are all sorts of questions about his role as a deserter and the like. So this is really not some great big negotiation that took place here. There was some incredible breakthrough. This was simply the U.S. government acquiescing to the demands of the Taliban, period.
If we look at the record, I've heard that this is like giving Mullah Omar his cabinet back. Are the selling point, at least for some of the reports out, to get Clapper on board and Hagel on board was the Taliban was decimated, so they won't have the operational structure to go back to. Are you buying that?
No, they're not decimated. They're still very much in the game. I mean, the level after the surge, one of the things I pointed out, based on NATO's own statistics, the insurgency in Afghanistan, there was this big claim that they broke the momentum of the Taliban. Okay, all they meant by that was that the level of violence didn't increase at an ever-increasing rate. Okay, the level of violence in Afghanistan was actually still higher than pre-surge levels when we started drawing down troops in Afghanistan. In other words, they're still carrying out an incredibly violent campaign. They are still in control of spots in Afghanistan and are going to seize more territory in Afghanistan as we further draw down. We've not broken them at all. That's sort of part of the mythology here. But, even if we had broken them or decimated their leadership ranks, the story from 2007 should be a cautionary tale for all of us, okay? And the story is this. A guy named Mullah Zakir, who studied how to become the greatest insurgent that he could be at Guantanamo when he was in prison there, was released in 2007. Mullah Zakir was the subordinate to one of these 5. In other words, he was not as senior as one of the 5, any of the 5 that were released, but he was actually the direct subordinate to one of them, okay? He's released in 2007. He goes on to become the senior-most Taliban military commander in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He goes on to run the military operations for the Taliban. And what does he do? He kills directly at least 12 U.S. Marines that we know of, and he makes decisions that impact the lives of thousands and thousands of people. People that we don't really hear much about because they're not Westerners, local Afghan civilians, Muslim populations, people who really are on the front lines in this fight who don't get enough attention, I would argue. But he makes decisions that affect thousands and thousands of lives. That's one guy who was released from Guantanamo in 2007. That's how important he was. So there's sort of this idea that these guys can't do that much damage because they're just 5 guys. But these guys are actually more senior to him, and they're going to be in Qatar for a year where they can do fundraising and enjoy propaganda. They'll probably start reintegrating themselves back in operations. But as soon as they're back in Afghanistan and Pakistan, you can bet they'll start taking charge of their command once again.
What message does it send not only the Taliban, but other rogue regimes, and specifically the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, arguably the foundation of it, and that would be Iran, when you see these 5 thugs being welcomed into the arms of the folks that brokered the deal?
Well, I mean, Iran already knows that we're desperate, the U.S. government is desperate to try and disentangle itself from the greater Middle East, and that it's really willing to, the U.S. government and the Obama administration is willing to bend over backwards to even achieve the appearance of some kind of deal with these regimes. They know we're a weak negotiating partner, or weak negotiating opponent as it is. So, they already know that. I think that message has already been sent a long time ago. The bottom line here is, however, I would say in all this, is that there's sort of this wishful thinking fantasy that goes through some of the commentary on this, as you heard with that idea that there was some breakthrough here in negotiations. This is basically America retreating from the fight. This is America saying we don't want to fight anymore. My warning, as you know, Crane, I've talked to you for years now, is that the enemy gets a vote, and the enemy is going to continue to fight on, and these guys are going to continue to fight on.
Speaking of delusional and just flat out wrong. Susan Rice was asked about Gitmo, and she returned to a line that we've heard before that you've been on this program years back to discuss, and that is that Gitmo is a cause of terrorism, of hostility. Here it is yesterday Sunday's CNN's Candy Crawley's program, and here she is being asked about Gitmo. It is cut number 18. Roll it.
The terrorists are intent on doing what they're going to do. But Candy, we have a commitment to close Guantanamo Bay. The president's been very clear about that. The existence of Guantanamo Bay is itself a detriment to our national security, which is why the president has prioritized closing it and why we intend to get that done.
Tom?
I mean, it's just a generic term now. It's not saying, remember, the Obama administration used to proclaim, and we talked about this a while ago, that Guantanamo was the #1 recruitment tool for al-Qaeda. Remember, the president himself said that. They gave up on that claim when I just basically beat that argument down every which way you can imagine. I mean, empirically, I went through all the al-Qaeda propaganda videos I could get my hands on and showed that it was Guantanamo was mentioned, in a single-digit percentage of the time. It was, an infinitesimally small amount of their propaganda was focused on Guantanamo. So now it's just this generic talk about being a national security problem. Well, I mean, what does that even mean? I don't know. But the bottom line is these 5 guys have not killed anyone for the last 12 years. You can bet that they will raise funds for killing, that they'll take part in propaganda efforts, and eventually some of them will resume their command positions within the Taliban. And so people within the next couple of years will die because of these 5 people. That's just the simple fact of the matter. And so, I don't think that Ms. Rice can point to anybody's life that was lost because of Guantanamo along these lines in terms of it being a national security problem for the U.S., where I think we can point very easily to lives that have been lost because people have been released from Guantanamo before, because detainees went back to the fight. So I've got empirical evidence on my side of the equation. I don't see any on hers.
One of the things you're combating is the ignorance and the willful blindness, to coin a phrase of Andrew C. McCarthy, another person like you who's done extraordinary work on understanding this, and obviously the trial of the blind sheik. I want to get to that in a second, but Blake Hunsell, I'm thinking of the Politico editor here. This is from Town Hall Tip Sheet. What's the argument that these 5 Taliban guys are so dangerous? Are they ninjas? Do they have superpowers? Are we fighting willful blindness, general ignorance, both? Why is there a resistance to what you've just talked about? The empirical evidence. Clapper had that, certainly. Leon Panetta, no longer a member of the administration, had that. Chuck Hagel had it. What's going on here, Tom?
I mean, that sentiment, I think, is not atypical of the American elite, and we have a real problem with the elite in this country, in Washington and elsewhere. It's, one of the reasons I try and stay away from Washington as much as I can, although I have to go there to testify and do those sorts of things. But, you have a lot of people who just stick their heads in the sand. The 2 of these guys have been wanted for war crimes by the UN for years, for their suspected role in the mass murder of thousands of Shiite Muslims in Afghanistan, and yet you can still have a prominent member of the American elite wondering why these guys are considered to be so dangerous. This is not rocket science. All you have to do is pick up one of their files, which you can get files for all 5 of them, by the way, on the New York Times website, and look up, what the established facts are about them. And it's not difficult. These guys are dangerous for a reason. Are deemed dangerous for a reason. They have extensive dossiers. And, let me say this about them as well. There's a lot of talk in Washington about how the Taliban is some, mutually exclusive separate entity from al-Qaeda, something that we can cleave off and treat as a separate, distinct organization. Look at the biographies of these 5 guys, as I've written them up, or even go back to the underlying files that I linked to. All five of them were deeply tied to al-Qaeda prior to 9/11. All 5 of them were guys who either assisted al-Qaeda or received assistance from al-Qaeda in their joint fight inside Afghanistan prior to 9/11. Their biographies disprove a lot of the nonsense you hear about the Taliban and al-Qaeda and the idea that we can somehow convince the Taliban to renounce al-Qaeda. It just isn't going to happen.
What does this mean for the future of Afghanistan and the likes of India, in light of the fact that the Taliban have safe haven in Pakistan?
Well, we never came up with a solution for Pakistan. It's something we've talked about quite a bit. The Pakistan is the prime sponsor of the Taliban, of course. They really helped create it originally, all the way back in 1994. They were behind its rise to power. And all these years, Mullah Omar and his the senior commanders who have not been killed and captured, by the way, on the claim that they've been decimated and their leadership organization is gone, that's just not true. And one of the main reasons it's not true is because most of the leadership of the Taliban is in Pakistan, and they've been sitting sheltered there for years and years and years. So there have not been these signature strikes against Taliban senior leaders in Pakistan because we've tried to focus on this small area, the small kill box in northern Pakistan, on the al-Qaeda operatives who are immediately targeting us. So most of the rest of the infrastructure actually remains in place. These guys have an organization to go back to, So the big picture story here is that our enemies are going to keep fighting on. And what I keep saying to the American people is, think about, what happened, in the years leading up to 9/11, where sort of America sort of vacated its role in trying to figure out what to do in a place like Afghanistan. After the jihad against the Soviets, America sort of disentangled itself. Now we have a whole another generation of jihadis who are now going to see America withdrawing from the fight. Okay. Now, the myth, the central myth that they're founded on is this idea that they defeated the Soviet Union, one superpower. Now a second one is withdrawing from the fight and is willing to basically give up, senior Taliban commanders, in very short order. Okay. What message does that send to the next generation of jihadis?
Tom Joscelyn, if we look at history, we will look at the future, and it sets an awful poor events in the future. Thank you so much for being with us.